Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video we will be looking at Milgram's 1973 Obedience to Authority Figures study, which you need to know for AQA A-level psychology in the subtopic of social influence. I hope you enjoy this video and find it helpful. Let's get started. Milgram's study was published 6 months after the execution of Adolf Eichmann for his part in the murder of millions of Jews in the Holocaust. During his trial, and just like many other war criminals brought to justice, he maintained he was only obeying orders given to him. Milgram aimed to investigate whether ordinary people would obey a legitimate authority figure even when required to injure and inflict harm into an innocent person. Milgram conducted a laboratory study in the psychology laboratory at Yale University. He used 40 male American volunteers, between 20 to 50 years old, who responded to an advert in the newspaper. Participants were invited individually and on arrival were introduced to an experimenter in a white lab coat and another middle-aged man who they were led to believe was another volunteer called Mr. Wallace, when in truth he was a Confederate. The naive participants deceived into believing that the study was about how punishment affected learning, and one person would be the teacher while the other would be the learner. The naive participant and Mr. Wallace drew lots to decide which role they would play. However, this was rigged, so the naive participant would always be the teacher and Mr. Wallace, the Confederate, would always be the learner. They were placed in a room with a shock generator, and the naive participant, who was the designated teacher, was instructed to administer an increasingly severe electric shock to the learner every time they answered a question incorrectly in a word pairing task. Shocks ranged from 15 volts, slight shock, to 450 volts, danger, severe shock. The naive participants were given a shock of 45 volts to convince them that this was authentic, and Mr. Wallace, learner Confederate, was strapped to the chair in the room next door and was told to give mostly incorrect answers. Mr. Wallace, learner Confederate, did not actually receive any shocks, although this was unknown to the naive participant, teacher. Each time he was shocked by the naive participant for an incorrect response, a variety of recorded responses were played of increasing pain and distress. At 150 volts, the Mr. Wallace, learner Confederate, would begin to protest and refuse to take part any further in the study, complaining of heart problems. At 315 volts, he would scream loudly, and from 330 volts and upwards, he would not respond at all. If the naive participant, teacher, objected or displayed resistance to continue, they were given a series of verbal prods to continue the experiment, e.g., please continue, the experiment requires that you continue, and you have no other choice, you must go on, by an authority figure, experimenter, who wore a lab coat. He found that 65% of participants administered the highest level of shock, 450 volts, despite apparent distress and reluctance. 100% of the participants went up to at least 300 volts. Only 5 participants, 12.5%, stopped administering shocks at 300 volts. It was qualitatively recorded that some participants began to show signs of distress, such as laughing nervously, sweating, stuttering, biting their lip, groaning, digging their fingernails into their hands, or trembling, while others showed no signs of distress, focusing only on administering the shocks and continuing to obey. Some participants argued with the experimenter but still continued to obey. 3 participants had full-blown uncontrollable seizures with no past history of seizures. Prior to carrying out his experiment, Milgram had asked 14 psychology students and other colleagues to predict how far participants would go. The majority of the opinion was no more than 3% would continue to 450 volts. Participants were debriefed and assured their behavior was normal. In a follow-up questionnaire, 84% reported they felt glad to have participated and 74% felt they had learnt something of personal importance. The experiment demonstrated that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of harming another individual. This suggests that situational factors, such as the presence of an authority figure, can significantly influence obedience. Milgram's study has several strengths and limitations. A strength of Milgram's study is that it has good internal validity. Sheridan and King's, 1972, participants gave real shocks to a puppy in response to orders from an experimenter, 54% of males and 100% of females delivered what they thought was a fatal shock. This is a strength because it suggests that individuals can be influenced to perform actions they might not typically engage in when directed by an authority figure. The study underscores how obedience to authority figures can lead people to act against their own moral beliefs or values. A strength of Milgram's study is that it has good external validity. Milgram argued that the lab-based relationship between experimenter and participant reflected wider real-life authority relationships. Hoeffling et al., 1966, found that levels of obedience in nurses on a hospital ward to unjustified demands by doctors were very high. 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed. This is a strength because it suggests that the dynamics of authority and obedience observed in controlled laboratory settings, as demonstrated by Milgram's study and supported by Hoeffling et al.'s research, are reflective of real-world scenarios. The findings highlight the significant influence of authority figures on individuals' behavior in various contexts, emphasizing the importance of understanding and addressing the impact of authority in society. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it lacks internal validity. Orn and Holland, 1968, suggested that participants guessed the electric shocks were fake and therefore Milgram was not testing what he intended to study, obedience. Gina Perry, 2013, listened to tapes of Milgram's participants and reported that approximately only a half of participants believed the shocks were real. 2/3 of these participants were disobedient. This is a limitation because it suggests that the results of Milgram's study may have been influenced by participants' skepticism about the authenticity of the electric shocks, potentially leading to a distortion of the true levels of obedience observed. This raises questions about the validity of the study's conclusions regarding obedience to authority in real-world situations. A limitation of Milgram's study is that there is an alternative explanation. Social identity theory, SIT, suggests that obedience is about group identification. Milgram's participants identified with the experimenter, science of the study. When obedience levels fell, the participants identified more with the victim. Haslam and Reiher, 2012, suggested that the first 3 prods are appeals for help with science. Only the 4th prod demands obedience, as every time this was used, the participants stopped. Therefore, they concluded that participants gave shocks due to their identification with the experimenter as a scientist, rather than because of obedience. This is a limitation because it suggests that the participants' behavior in Milgram's study might have been influenced more by their identification with the experimenter as a scientist rather than solely by obedience to authority. This alternative perspective highlights the importance of considering the role of social identity and group dynamics in understanding human behavior within the context of obedience experiments. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it lacks control of confounding and extraneous variables. Milgram did not consider the possibility that individual differences and personality trait could also determine the extent to which a person obeys an authority figure. Some people may be more inclined to follow orders, whereas others may feel as though they have the ability to control the situation and their own behavior, e.g. the 5 participants who stopped at 300 volts. This is a limitation because it suggests that individual differences in personality traits could have influenced the participants' responses in Milgram's study, indicating that obedience levels might not solely be attributed to the authority figure's commands but also to inherent individual characteristics. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it suffers from gender bias. The sample only consisted of male participants. Females, for example, may be more likely to obey an authority figure, as females are often socialized in some cultures to be more complaint and submissive. This suggests the study ignores or minimizes the difference between men and women in relation to obedience to authority figures. This is a limitation because it suggests that the result of the study cannot be generalized to other genders, e.g. women. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it suffers from cultural bias. The sample only consists of Americans. America is an individualist culture, where people are generally obey less, and the results may be different in collectivist cultures such as Asian countries, where people are generally more obedient. This is limitation because it suggests that the results cannot be generalized to other cultures and countries, e.g. China. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it lacks population validity. The study consisted of male adults between the ages of 20–50. This does not include children, teenagers, or senior citizens. This is a limitation because it suggests that the results of this study cannot be generalized to other age groups, e.g. children and senior citizens. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it lacks ecological validity. Milgram's study was conducted in a controlled laboratory setting, which doesn't mirror the complexities and nuances of social interactions of obedience in natural environments. The controlled setting could have influenced the participants to behave differently than they would in their daily lives. This is a limitation because it suggests that the results of this study cannot be generalized to real-world environments, as the results do not accurately reflect how people would behave in a real-world setting due to the artificial nature of the environment. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it lacks mundane realism. The task of giving participants an electric shock for incorrect answers is an artificial task, which is a task that people don't typically encounter in their everyday lives. The consequences of obeying in this situation are quite extreme compared to the consequences that a person would face in their day-to-day lives, e.g. obeying a teacher is not going to lead to a person causing psychological or physical harm to another person. This is a limitation because it suggests that the findings of this study do not generalize to everyday situations where consequences of obeying are less extreme. The next limitation is the most important limitation of Milgram's study. A limitation of Milgram's study is that it broke several ethical guidelines. Baumrind, 1964, criticized Milgram's deceptions. Milgram deceived participants into believing that they were taking part in a study on how punishment affects learning, rather than obedience. They were also deceived by the rigging of the role allocation, which was in fact predetermined, and participants were also deceived into believing that the shocks they were administering were real. Milgram did not protect the participants from psychological or physical harm. As a result, many participants showed signs of extreme distress and guilt throughout the experiment, as well as afterwards at the fact that they could have potentially harmed another human being. Milgram also refused his participants the right to withdraw, as when participants asked to stop, they were given verbal prods to encourage them to remain within the experiment. This is a limitation because it suggests that Milgram did not prioritize or think about his participants' psychological and physical well-being whilst they were participating in the study. This potentially damaged the reputation of psychology, and the reputation of psychology's research as deception is a betrayal of trust, and deception of participants may also make them less likely to volunteer for future research. However, it could be argued that the study's breach of ethical guidelines could be justified by cost-benefit analysis, as the results and information gained from Milgram's research might outweigh the ethical concerns involved. Milgram's study highlighted the dangers of blind obedience in certain situations. If participants weren't deceived, then the study would have lost reliability and validity, as it would have been most likely that the participants would have displayed demand characteristics if they knew the true aim of the study. Furthermore, participants were debriefed and assured their behavior was normal. In a follow-up questionnaire, 84% reported they felt glad to have participated and 74% felt they had learned something of personal importance. This gained the research retrospective consent, and with the results stating that the majority of the participants were glad to have taken part, this suggests that the research might not have been so damaging. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Bye.